Well, here we are in 2021. I guess that you, like me, are kind of hoping it's going to be a better year than we had last year. You know, perhaps you can think back to this time last year, the start of 2020, and we were in that stage of thinking about the year ahead and making plans. You know, maybe you had holiday plans or developments in work or job or housing. All sorts of things we had mapped out. We as a church had events planned, things that we were going to do. Because we could plan back then. Life had always been fairly predictable. We knew that if we made these plans, we would very probably be able to stick to them. And then everything changed. And so many of our plans for the year just couldn't happen. And so maybe as we approach this year, we've got a slightly different feeling about that. We've gotten used to not planning things quite so far ahead. We've gotten used to living maybe a bit more reactively, responding to the circumstances around us and adapting and changing as things happen. Does that mean then that we can't, at the start of this new year, plan ahead, that we can't think about where we're headed both individually and as a church? Well, as we start out this new year together, I want us to focus in on this stuff. Water. Water is fundamental to life. And water is responsible for shaping so much of the world around us. You know, not just in terms of the physical landscape. We know how water in the ice ages carved out valleys and rivers have carved out down the middles of them, and the sea that builds up or erodes our coastline. But not just in that sense has water shaped our world. It's water that has been such a determining factor in where ancient civilizations grew up. People needed to live in places where they had access to water, not just for them to drink, but for them to be able to water their crops, to grow food. And so water and where it's found and what it's doing has shaped so much of our world. It's perhaps not surprising then that being so fundamental to our existence, water is also often used metaphorically. You know, the Bible talks about living water as a spiritual essential. Jesus described himself as the water of life, saying that anyone who came to him would never be thirsty again. So this morning we're going to be exploring water, both in the physical sense of our reliance on it, but also in that spiritual sense. And I think we perhaps need to have an awareness in doing that while we may be inclined to see the physical world and the spiritual world as these two separate things, that's not always how God's people have seen it. And they're perhaps not as separate as we realized. For God's people in the Bible, this physical reliance on water as provision for them, for their crops, was very closely tied in to their spiritual relationship with him. When they were walking closely with God, there was that promise that he would provide water for their crops, that they would be successful in their farming. Times of drought for God's people would often be, yes, times of physical drought, but also times of spiritual drought. So as we explore this theme of water this morning, let's have that openness to tying together the physical and the spiritual aspects. And we're going to start in the physical, going way back to the book of Deuteronomy. This is where God's people have been in slavery in Egypt. Through Moses, he has released them from that slavery. They've crossed the Red Sea, and they're now wandering through the Sinai desert, very much dependent on God for provision of water. And they're on their way to the promised land. For the Lord your God is bringing you into a good land, a land with brooks, streams, and deep springs gushing out into the valleys and hills. The land you are entering to take over is not like the land of Egypt from which you've come, where you planted your seed and irrigated it by foot as in a vegetable garden. But the land you are crossing the Jordan to take possession of is a land of mountains and valleys that drink rain from heaven. It is a land the Lord your God cares for. The eyes of the Lord your God are continually on it from the beginning of the year to its end. So let's get some kind of physical context to what's going on here for the Israelites as God promises them about the water in this new land. So they've come from Egypt. Now, in Egypt, the water supply was all about the River Nile. The Nile that runs down the central belt there was where everything was centred around. That was the water supply. And the way agriculture worked there, the Nile was incredibly predictable in its flooding patterns. And so they were able to work their crop rotations and their planting, knowing that at a certain time of year, the River Nile would flood over the fields. And that brought two things to the fields. It brought the water that soaked into the ground, watering it. And it also brought the rich river silt that brought nutrition and made that soil really fertile. So then when the floods receded, that would be the time that they would plant their crops in that freshly watered ground, and it would hopefully be enough to sustain through to that harvest period. Because the flooding cycle was quite predictable, they knew how long they would then need to wait before the next flood came. And so they were able to set up systems where they'd have tanks or whatever for water. So during the flood, they would fill up and then they'd store that water and be able to gradually release it over time once the flood subsided to keep things watered as an extra if needed. Right now, though, they've moved out of Egypt and they're actually crossing the Sinai Desert. And here, water is a lot harder to come by. And so if you read that story of the Exodus in the Bible, you hear of how during this season, they were so reliant on God for provision, for food and for water. We hear stories of how they came across a pool of bitter water and God showed them how to make it clean to drink. All the time when the people were getting so cross with Moses because they were here in the desert with nothing to drink, and Moses gets angry and hits a rock and a fountain of water bursts out of it. All those kinds of stories where they were just so dependent day to day on God to show them the next water supply that they needed. They're moving, though, into this promised land, the land of Canaan, or what will become Israel. And God promises them that this is a land where they're going to have a water supply. In this land, they've got the River Jordan. It's not quite the same as the River Nile, though. It hasn't got that same predictable flooding pattern. And they've got these mountainous areas where there are perhaps streams, but there's also springs of water and the like. And so when they move into this promised land and become established there, there's a number of ways that they manage their water supply. So first of all, yes, you've got rivers, in particular the River Jordan, but not everyone was able to live right by that river. They also had a number of springs. Jerusalem is well known for its water supply. It being up a hill, it's not down by the river. Its water supply comes from the Gihon spring. And they had to, with that, because it wasn't always reliable, they had to work in some aqueducts and some cisterns, which we'll talk about later. In some areas, if there wasn't water readily available at surface level, they dug wells. Now, in this area here where I am in my garden, if you'd only need to dig down sort of 0.5 metre or so, and you would find water. But in the promised land, they had to dig a lot deeper. They had to dig these really deep wells, many of which had actually been there since long before then. We read way back at the beginning of the Bible in the stories in Genesis of how they used wells during that time, that they would be able to reach down to the water underground and draw it up. They also had cisterns, which are a bit like my water butts. So when the rains did come, the cisterns would collect the water from the rain so that they could use it later on. Being winter at the moment, my water butts are really nice and full. In the summer, they often dry out, which I suspect is a problem that Israel had as well. But also, as well as their cisterns, in order to get the water to where they needed it, they would have had aqueducts. Now, we perhaps picture aqueducts as these big bridges, these very ornate bridges, but actually an aqueduct is just any means by which you are piping water from its source to the place where you need it. And I actually have my own little aqueduct in my garden because I have these water butts which collect the water off my garage roof here. But then right up the end of the garden, I need water for my vegetable garden and for where I keep my chickens. And so there's a pipe from this water butt that runs all the way up the garden to fill some water butts up there so that I have a water supply there too. So they had all these different means of managing their water supply in the promised land. Let's go see the chickens and the veg garden with this water now. So here we go. This is the other end of my aqueduct, which actually is just a hose pipe, which carries the water from those other water butts to these two here so that I have water up at the end of the garden. And we're more reliant on that than ever this winter because I don't know if you can see, but my poor old chickens aren't allowed to free range at the moment. Turns out it's not just us humans that are having a pandemic, but bird flu is going around in the bird population as well. And so everyone has to keep their chickens inside. So mine are currently housed inside the greenhouse and they don't get any rain inside there. So they are utterly dependent on me every day filling up their water trough from my water butts here. So Israel had all of these systems of managing their water supply. It was all very practical and physical. But remember what we've said about there being that link for them between the physical and the spiritual. You know, in that promise we read from Deuteronomy where God is talking to them about this promised land, he says that the land he's taking them to, this land of Israel, drinks rain from heaven. This idea that God cares for it with his provision of the rain, that God's eyes are on it, looking out for it. So yes, they may have to work and manage their water supply. They may have to dig wells. They may have to be wise in how they use cisterns to store water for dry seasons, or in how they use aqueducts to move their water supply to the place it's needed. But ultimately, that physical provision is still strongly linked to God's spiritual provision. That when God is blessing them, he is blessing them with the rains, with the water. And that when they're in a time of physical drought, it is related to a time of spiritual drought when they're not walking so closely with God. But we're going to move forwards in time now, and we're going to hear from some of the prophecies of Isaiah. But now listen, Jacob, my servant, Israel, whom I have chosen. This is what the Lord says. He who made you, who formed you in the womb, and who will help you. Do not be afraid, Jacob, my servant, Jeshurun, whom I have chosen. For I will pour water on the thirsty land, and streams on the dry ground. I will pour out my spirit on your offspring, and my blessing on your descendants. They will spring up like grass in a meadow, like poplar trees by flowing streams. Some will say, I belong to the Lord. Others will call themselves by the name of Jacob. Still others will write on their hand, the Lord's, and will take the name Israel. So there's a sense in that passage from Isaiah where we're perhaps looking more at that metaphor of water, that spiritual scent of water as the pouring out of God's Spirit. Isaiah there is looking ahead to that time after Jesus has died and been resurrected and ascended to heaven, when God pours out his Spirit on all people. And what a beautiful picture that is in that passage of those trees growing by streams of water that are lush and alive because they've got that water supply. We've still got our Christmas tree up here next to me. We haven't got round to taking it down yet. And it's only the second year, actually, that we've had a real tree. And it never really occurred to me before that apparently you need to water them. There's a little trough thing at the bottom of the stand that you have to keep topped up with water to keep the tree alive, to stop it drying up and shedding all of its needles. And I don't know if you can see, but actually we didn't do such a good job of keeping it watered this year. There's a lot of pine needles on the floor here. A lot of you know our family was ill with COVID over the Christmas period, and so we perhaps weren't quite as on top of things as we usually would be, so it didn't get watered as much as it should. And it really shows now, especially as it's been up for a while, that just rubbing its branches here, I'm getting pine needles off in my hands. But I wonder if some of us perhaps feel a little bit like my Christmas tree. You know, we're perhaps all dressed up with the pretty things, the stuff to try and make it look good and fun and happy. But actually, maybe on the inside, we're feeling a bit dry and crunchy, perhaps. We're shedding leaves. And maybe we need a fresh drink of water. Maybe we need a fresh pouring out of God's Spirit, whether that's in the spiritual sense or whether it's in a physical sense that we need something fresh from God. But you know, the spiritual and the physical are linked more closely than we think. And so whichever area feels dry, both of them, we look to God in the Spirit for that fresh outpouring. But if we look a little further on in the Bible, to the words of Jeremiah the prophet, there's a warning for us. My people have committed two sins. They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water. They've dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water. You know, cisterns were essential to the management of water in ancient Israel. You know, if you're in a land where the water supply is unreliable or inconsistent, you needed to collect that water during the wet season when it was there so that you had it to use later when it was dry. But it's not that management of the water system that Jeremiah is getting at here, that God is saying is wrong. He's talking about idolatry. The fact that God's people were worshipping other gods. And the problem with worshipping other gods is that there is only one God. There is only one God who made the world. There is only one God who rules over the world and who has the power to bring things about in the world. There is only one God. And any other gods that they worshipped, any other idols that they worshipped, were therefore man-made. Things that they'd formed themselves. And because they were man-made, they were therefore flawed, cracked and broken, and leaking like those cisterns. And they would run dry, and they would let them down. Now, it's unlikely, I imagine, that you or I are in a position where we'd be worshipping a wooden or a metal idol as such. But I think we can still heed Jeremiah's warning there. Do we have broken systems in our lives? Do we have things that we've put in place in our lives that we've become reliant on, that we look to give us that sense of security, of knowing that, yes, when all else fails, I've got that thing. That's going to be there for me. Do we have broken systems that we're looking to instead of looking to God? Because those broken systems that we've made for ourselves leak, and they are going to be running dry. And God has promised us that He will pour out His Spirit on the dry ground around us. And that's where we should be looking, for the fountain of living water, not for those broken systems. And so, as we begin to plot our path through this year, we do it with a little hesitation, perhaps, holding on to any plans lightly, as we know that things may change as circumstances change around us. But I think one thing that we can plan, that we can commit to this year, is to look at our water supply, to look at where we're seeking that provision from, both the physical and the spiritual, and we can probably put the emotional and mental in there as well. Are we looking back at broken systems that are leaking, that aren't working? Or are we drinking from the springs of living water that God is pouring out around us? Have our old systems become idols to us? Have we got old ways or habits which have become stale, or routines which have become more important to us than actually following God's plan? Are there things we've become attached to which, like those broken systems, perhaps give us a false sense of security and are preventing us from looking to the springs of living water that God has promised? As we start this year, do we believe what Jesus said, that He is the water of life, and that anyone who comes to Him will never go thirsty? You know, a few weeks before Christmas, I was on one of my regular dog walks, and it was that time when we'd had loads and loads of rain. It felt like it had just rained every day, and the ground was absolutely saturated. The water was just running off the roads, and you could see it running into the freshly ploughed fields, and it was muddy and thick. And as I was walking, I noticed in the verge by the side of the road this new little spring that had popped up out of nowhere, just there at the side of the road, where normally there wouldn't be anything there. And if we believe that God is true to His promise in pouring out His Spirit, pouring that water out in the desert on the dry ground, being that water of life, then we should expect to see springs like that bubbling up all around us. The question is, are we noticing them? Or are we too busy checking the water levels in our cisterns? Or are we even trekking back to old rivers that are maybe many miles from us now, but because they're familiar, the path there is so well worn that we can do it without even thinking? As we start this new year, let's commit to abandoning our old systems, abandoning the broken systems, and looking for those springs of living water. And let's position ourselves within reach of those new springs. So can I encourage us, both individually and as a church, to take some time in prayer, to seek God on this, to ask Him to point out to us, what are the things that actually we're clinging on to but that have dried up? Where are the new springs that we need to position ourselves around now, that we need to drink deeply from? Let's take time. We've got a prayer meeting this evening on Zoom that you can join us for. And in our midweek groups, our small groups during the week, I'm going to ask us to spend time in prayer, seeking God on that for both ourselves individually, but also for us as a church, to look for those springs of living water. But right now, we want to worship God. We want to look to Him as our provider. And we're going to do that now by breaking bread together. The reason that God's Spirit is poured out to us all, the reason that we can all drink from that well of living water, is because of the sacrifice that He made, that removed that barrier so that we could come close to Him and drink deeply. And so let's take a moment now as we break bread, remembering His body that was broken for us. And as we share some juice or wine, remembering His blood that was poured out for us. Jesus, the living water, who went into death so that living water could gush out in fountains all around us. Let's break bread as we worship together now.